In the bitter altitude of the San Juan Mountains, survival was measured in degrees. For the crews of the Silverton Northern Survey, huddled in their camp at 11,000 feet, the winter of 1888 was a constant, losing battle. Men like Silas Croft, a man of 20 years' experience, followed the proven wisdom. Find a deep granite overhang, a cave camp, build a massive wall of dry stacked stone at its mouth, and keep a roaring bonfire blazing day and night. Yet inside Croft's camp, the temperature hovered a scant 10 degrees above the 15 degrees outside. Ice bearded the men's blankets, and the acrid smoke of a fire consuming a quarter cord of wood per night was the only reward for their labor. Miles away, in a shallow, unassuming alcove, U.S. Geological Survey Ranger Arthur Corrigan was mending a leather transit strap in his shirt sleeves. His shelter, deemed a sod and canvas folly by Croft, was silent, clear-aired, and according to the meticulous thermometer of a visiting engineer, a stable 44 degrees Celsius. It was, on average, 36 degrees warmer than the camps that followed conventional wisdom, and it did so using less than a tenth of the fuel. What did this lone surveyor understand about thermodynamics that generations of seasoned prospectors and miners had fundamentally missed? The rush for silver had pushed thousands of men into the Colorado high country, a landscape uniquely hostile to human life. The year was 1888, and the manuals of the day, from Army Quartermaster guides to the Prospector's Reliable Handbook, were unanimous on the subject of winter shelter. The doctrine was one of mass and brute force. Seek a deep cave or a massive rock overhang, preferably south-facing. Use the Earth's natural warmth. Block the opening with the thickest materials at hand: felled logs, boulders, multiple layers of oilcloth or canvas. The centerpiece was the fire. It was to be large, built just inside the mouth of the shelter, to create a wall of heat that would, in theory, repel the cold air and warm the rock mass behind the men. This was the right way. It was tangible. It looked strong. To build a fire was to fight back, and in the psyche of the frontier, fighting back was synonymous with survival. The entire culture of the high-altitude camps was built on this trust in massive, visible effort. A man's worth was in the wood he could haul, the rock he could move. The idea that less could be more was not just counterintuitive. It was seen as a sign of weakness or laziness. The failure of this conventional wisdom was a daily misery, nowhere more apparent than in Silas Croft's Eureka camp. Croft, a man whose hands were mapped with the scars of blasting cap and pick, had chosen the best shelter the gulch had to offer: a deep granite overhang, 30 feet wide and nearly 20 feet deep. His crew of 4 had spent a week improving it, felling a dozen mature pines to build a 10-foot-high wall of stone and log, chinked with mud that had frozen solid before it could even set. A heavy canvas curtain, stiff as sheet iron with ice, served as a door. Inside, the great fire roared, a 5-foot-wide pyre that devoured timber. But the physics of the shelter worked against them. The massive sub-zero granite of the mountain acted not as a radiator, but as a colossal, infinite heat sink, conducting warmth away faster than the fire could produce it. The fire, in its desperate need for oxygen, pulled a high-velocity draft of 15-degree air through every crack in the wall, racing across the floor and chilling the men from the boots up. Mr. Elias Thorne, a visiting mining engineer, placed his thermometer 2 feet from the fire, 65 degrees Celsius. 10 feet back, where the men slept, 12 degrees Celsius. The rock walls were coated in a thick, glittering rime. The smoke, failing to vent cleanly, eddied back into the cave, and the constant cough of the crew was as predictable as the howling wind. They were spending 6 hours of precious daylight just cutting and hauling wood for the fire that was barely keeping them alive. Productivity was at a standstill. Survival itself was a matter of grim arithmetic, and the equation was not in their favor. Arthur Corrigan was a different kind of man. He was not a prospector. He was a surveyor, a man of instruments, charts, and quiet observation. His origins were not in the brawling camps of the West, but in the frugal, stony hills of New Hampshire. His father, a mason, had built central chimney farmhouses, Structures designed not for brute force, but for the meticulous management of a single, precious fire. Corrigan had studied engineering for 2 years at Dartmouth before the money ran out, and he carried a deep respect for the unseen laws of convection, conduction, and radiation. His education had been completed not in a classroom, but on the northern plains during his military service. He had been tasked with mapping assignments near Ute and Bannock encampments. He didn't just see their lodges, he studied them. He saw that the hide teepees were not single-walled, but had an inner lining, a second skin of canvas or hide that stopped 6 feet from the ground. This lining, he realized, created a convective envelope. Cold air coming under the outer wall was channeled up this gap, and warmed by the small central fire, rose to the smoke hole without ever touching the occupants. He saw that their fires were tiny, disciplined, and that the earth itself was insulated with thick furs. He learned that the enemy was not the cold, but heat loss. When he arrived at the survey camp and declined a space in Croft's fortress, choosing a shallow exposed alcove, the men laughed. "The college boy wants his own room," Croft had sneered. "He'll be begging for a spot by the fire for morning." Corrigan just nodded, unrolled his schematics, and began to work. His chosen spot seemed, to all, to be worthless. It was a shallow granite recess, barely 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide. Croft would have ignored it. Corrigan, however, saw it not as a shelter, but as a foundation. His first move baffled the camp. He began to dig. Using his pick, he excavated the floor of the alcove down by 3 feet, leaving a level platform at the back. He then built his wall, but he built it 4 feet back from the alcove's opening, creating a small, roofed porch. This wall was the heart of his secret. It was not a heavy wall of stone or log. It was a composite wall, a light frame built from scavenged aspen poles, which the others deemed useless for firewood. On both sides of this light frame he stretched tattered canvas salvaged from a broken wagon. He now had a 6-inch thick hollow wall. Into this gap, he meticulously, obsessively, packed his key material: dried tundra moss and sod, harvested from below the tree line weeks earlier and hauled up by mule. This was not insulation as they knew it. This was trapped air. He built a small, low door and a single 12-inch square window opening, which he covered with a greased sheet of parchment. To Silas Croft, watching from a distance, it looked like a prairie sod house, a flimsy thing of grass and cloth. "A single gust will take that thing apart," he said to his crew. "It's a tinderbox built of weeds." Corrigan, hearing the criticism, simply continued to pack his moss, his movements precise, his confidence rooted not in tradition, but in physics. The conflict was one of fundamental philosophies. The brute force method, embodied by Silas Croft, was a war of attrition. It assumed that if you threw enough mass at the problem, massive rocks, massive logs, a massive fire, you could overpower the cold. But as the engineer Elias Thorne knew, the sub-zero granite of the mountain possessed a thermal mass so vast as to be infinite. Croft's fire was not heating his cave. It was attempting to heat the entire San Juan Range. It was a battle against the law of thermal conduction, and the mountain would always win. Corrigan's philosophy was one of control. He called it the thermal envelope. He was not trying to heat the mountain. He was trying to heat a tiny 8 by 10-foot box of air. His entire design was built around defeating the 3 modes of heat loss. His moss-packed wall, with its millions of tiny air pockets, defeated conduction. Heat could not easily pass through it. His tiny, tight-fitting door and the airlock of his covered porch defeated convection. Warm air could not escape, and cold drafts could not enter. And his small, efficient stove, radiating heat in all directions, would bounce that energy off the insulated walls, warming the interior of the envelope, not the rock behind it. It was brute force thermodynamics versus systems engineering. The arrival of Elias Thorne, the mining company's chief engineer, provided the first hard data. Thorne was a man of cold calculation, sent to assess the viability of winter operations. He carried a certified thermometer, an anemometer, and a notebook. His first visit was to the main camp. He recorded his findings with a grim expression. Exterior ambient, 8 deg. Wind, 15 mph. Shelter. Interior, 15 feet from fire, 14 degree. Floor, 11 degree. Air quality, poor. Fuel consumption, est. 220 lbs. Green pine per 12 hours. He then made his way to Corrigan's Folly. He was skeptical, noting the flimsy-looking wall. He stooped to enter the low, canvas-flapped porch. Then a second, inner flap. He stepped inside. The air was perfectly still. It was warm. He unbuttoned his heavy coat. Corrigan sat on his raised bunk, reading. A tiny sheet metal stove, no bigger than a bread box, hissed quietly in the corner. Thorne consulted his thermometer. He waited 5 minutes for it to acclimate. He read the mercury. 48 degrees Fahrenheit. He checked the stove. It was burning aspen sticks no thicker than his thumb. His official report, wired to Denver, was stark. Mr. Corrigan's shelter, utilizing a composite sod and canvas wall, maintains a temperature 40 degrees above ambient while consuming approximately 40 lbs of scrap wood per 24 hours. This represents a 90% reduction in fuel for a 100% increase in habitable space. Recommend immediate study of his thermal trap design. Corrigan's secret was, in fact, a system of 5 distinct interlocking layers. The first was the windbreak. By building inside the shallow alcove, he used the rock itself as his primary defense, deflecting the 70 mph gusts that would have otherwise shredded his structure. The rock was his shield, not his home. The second layer was the insulated envelope. This was his 6-inch thick wall packed with moss and sod. The genius of it was the moss. It was not for structure, but for its dead air properties. It was, in effect, 19th-century fiberglass batting. This wall stopped conductive heat loss almost completely. The third layer was the cold sink and raised floor. The 3-foot pit he had dug at the entrance in the porch area was a thermal trap. Any cold air that inevitably leaked through the outer flap, being heavier than the warm air inside, would fall into this pit and stay there, unable to rise over the threshold into the main living space. His sleeping bunk, raised 18 inches off the main floor, ensured he was always floating in the warmest stratum of air. The fourth layer was the Arctic entry. The 2 canvas flaps, separated by the 4-foot porch, created a rudimentary airlock. He never exposed the inner, warm room to the outside air. To enter, one had to close the outer flap before opening the inner one. This stopped convective loss. The fifth and final layer was the heat engine and managed respiration. His tiny stove was a masterpiece of efficiency. It was small, meaning it heated up quickly, and its sheet metal body radiated heat 360 degrees. But its true genius was its breathing. He had run a small 2-inch pipe from the stove's air intake down into the cold sink. His fire was not stealing the warm, breathable air of the room. It was breathing the cold, useless air from the trap. Its flue pipe, venting the smoke, ran 4 feet horizontally inside the shelter, before exiting up a rock chimney. This afterburner pass wrung every last calorie of heat from the exhaust gases before they were lost to the mountain. It was a closed, managed, and brilliant system. The true test came in the first week of February. A great blizzard, a 3-day norther, descended on the San Juans. The temperature plunged to 22 degrees, with winds gusting to hurricane force. For Silas Croft's camp, it was a catastrophe. The 70 mph wind found every crack in their stone wall. The pressure differential turned the massive fire into a raging vortex, a giant bellows that sucked snow and 22 degrees of air into the shelter. The canvas door was shredded in the first hour. The men huddled, scorching their faces while their backs froze, desperately feeding their entire wood supply into the fire. By the morning of the second day, their wood was gone. The fire died. The shelter, with its massive heat-sucking rock walls, rapidly became a 20-degree tomb. In Corrigan's shelter, the world was silent. The alcove protected him from the wind. His insulated wall held. The tiny stove hissed, consuming 3 to 4 small sticks an hour. He was so comfortable he had to open his inner ventilation flap slightly to keep the temperature from rising above 55 degrees. On the morning of the third day, the storm broke. The sky was a cruel, clear blue. The official temperature was 25 degrees. Elias Thorne, his face masked in ice, staggered to Corrigan's alcove. He pounded on the outer flap. Corrigan opened it, holding a tin cup of coffee, wearing a wool shirt. Thorne, his calibrated thermometer in hand, stepped into the airlock, then into the shelter. He watched the mercury. It settled at 51 degrees, a 76-degree differential from the air outside. That morning, Thorne and Corrigan mounted a rescue. They found Croft and his crew alive, but only just, huddled together under frozen blankets. They were suffering from severe hypothermia. The 8-by-10-foot shelter became an infirmary. The Folly became a lifeboat. The 5 men, Corrigan, Thorne, and Croft's 3-man crew, now filled the small space. And this is where Corrigan's engineering discipline transformed into operational management. He was in command. Elias Thorne, the engineer, became his second, marveling at the system's resilience. The rules were simple and absolute. 1. The airlock was sacred, 1 man at a time. 2. The stove was fed 2 sticks every 45 minutes. No more. Croft, in a delirium, tried to stuff it with wood. Corrigan gently pushed his hand away. "She'll choke, Silas. This isn't a bonfire." 3. A pot of water always simmered, its steam managing the humidity, making the 54 degree feel more like 60 degree. 4. A ventilation check every hour. Corrigan would crack the inner flap for 60 seconds to flush the CO2 from 5 breathing men, then seal it again. The 3-foot cold sink did its job, swallowing the influx of cold air before it could chill the room. For 2 days, the 5 men lived in this tiny, warm, quiet box. Silas Croft, his hands regaining feeling, sat on the bunk and simply watched the moss-packed wall, his mind slowly comprehending the physics that had saved his life. He wasn't broken not by the cold, but by the shattering of his own most deeply held conventional wisdom. Elias Thorne's official report to the Denver Assay Office was a bombshell. It contained little information about silver veins, but was instead a 20-page technical analysis of sub-zero habitation, the Corrigan thermal envelope principle. It was filled with statistics. Lost man-hours, Croft Camp, 14 days, 180. Lost man-hours, Corrigan Shelter, 0. Fuel expenditure, 30-day period. Croft Camp, 4 men, 6 cords. Corrigan Shelter, 1 man, 0.5 cords. Average sustained interior temperature, 10 degree force ambient. Croft, plus 5 degree Veers. Corrigan, plus 41 degree. The 36-degree difference was now official. The mining company, facing a winter of catastrophic losses, immediately scrapped its plans for a massive log-built bunkhouse. That spring, surveyors returning to the high country saw a strange sight. Silas Croft, his own crew, not searching for a deep cave, but meticulously cutting tundra sod and supervising the construction of a dozen small, composite wall shelters, each with its own Arctic entry and cold sink. The hardware merchant in Durango, flooded with orders, began stocking small-gauge stovepipe and selling prefabricated airtight Ranger stoves. The 1889 edition of the USGS Field Guide for High-Altitude Surveyors quietly removed the section on brute force firewalls and replaced it with a detailed 7-page schematic of Corrigan's 5-layer system. The legacy was written on the landscape. The high-altitude camps of the 1890s looked different. They were smaller, smarter, and quieter. The massive smoking bonfires were gone, replaced by thin, efficient wisps of smoke from hundreds of stovepipes. The sod house, once an object of ridicule, had become the standard for survival. Arthur Corrigan's innovation was not, in the end, an invention. He had created no new material, no new machine. He had simply been the first to observe, understand, and then meticulously apply the fundamental laws of energy. The great challenge of the frontier, he proved, was not a lack of resources, but a misunderstanding of efficiency. He had taught a generation of men, forged in the brute force mentality of an abundant continent, that survival in the face of impossible cold was not a battle of strength, but a victory of design, and that the greatest barrier against a 25-degree wind was not a wall of stone, but 6 inches of still, trapped air.